Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Penning. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And what you just saw was one of a series of 4 videos that we worked with Dr. Lloyd to produce a couple of years ago, and now you can find on YouTube. But he was kind enough to come out and give some of our students who are in our Washington, D.C. Leadership in the American Presidency program a tour of Philadelphia. And so today, here at the confines of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, you're going to get a version of that same tour, and some of those same questions that he asked the students there. What do we remember? What do we preserve? Are going to be a big part of what we talk about today. So with that, welcome to Constitution Day 2019. It's tradition here at the library that we begin each and every event with the Pledge of Allegiance, and so tonight, in honor of the 232nd birthday of the Constitution of our country, and the men and women, past and present, who put their lives on the line to defend the very freedoms that it outlines, please rise and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I do want to thank a couple of our favorite friends here at the Reagan Foundation, Beatrice and Rosemary, who, in addition to being docents here, are also the reason that each and every one of you had a copy of the Constitution when you walked in today. And we want to thank them. We worked with them for several years in putting this program together, so thank you to Beatrice. We're here today. This is a piece of civic learning, civic education. It's something that Gordon and I, we've been doing this now for 10 years. Every once in a while we have quarterly board meetings out in Malibu. We discuss the importance of civic learning and the importance of the Constitution and how important it is to teach today's young people about what it means. So before I turn it over to Gordon, I am a former teacher myself, and I want to give a brief history of the word civic. So the word civic comes from a Latin term, corona civica, which means civic crown. So during the Roman Republic, the corona civica was awarded to those who best exemplified what it meant to be a citizen. This is probably most famously portrayed in art through Augustus, who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire, and earned the corona civica for bringing to an end the civil wars that followed the assassination of Caesar. For what it's worth, Augustus chose to root his title in his role as citizen as well. And he chose the title Princeps Civitatis, and pardon me, my Latin is terrible, but my English is okay. It means first citizen of the state. So as head of the Roman Empire, he chose the term first citizen of the state. So the word civic and civic learning dates back to the concept of being an engaged citizen from the very beginning. Now, modern definitions of the word civic are a little bit more broad and diverse. So if you look at Merriam-Webster, it defines civic meaning of or relating to a citizen, a city, citizenship, or community affairs. Things like civic duty, civic pride, and civic leaders are often offered as examples of how this word might be used. Alternatively, you might go to the Urban Dictionary. Does anybody know the Urban Dictionary? The Urban Dictionary is an online crowdsourced dictionary, and so I looked up the word civic in this. There are 70 different definitions of the word civic in the Urban Dictionary, some of which are not repeatable here. 69 of those 70 are definitions of the Honda Civic. Typical of these many different insults and hot takes and descriptions of Honda Civics are this one. This is the 4th most popular definition of the 70. Definition 1, a Japanese economy car. Definition number 2, a car that teenagers' rich parents buy them as cheap, reliable transportation, but then they mess it all up by putting huge spoilers on them and try to drive fast and race everyone, and they think they're really cool, but everyone's really just laughing at them. The only exception to this lively debate about what a Honda Civic is and isn't is on the 2nd page. It's the 8th definition down, and it's offered by a user named Joe the Student, who defines civics as this: possibly the most useless class that kids today are forced to take, learn about the government, about issues that no one cares about. The lesson here, don't believe the Urban Dictionary. It's true, though, because civic learning has not really been a priority in this country for a long time. Less than a third of students, certainly not the ones who are here with us tonight, can explain the purpose of the Bill of Rights, even though the purpose is in the title. Last week, Justice Neil Gorsuch of the Supreme Court was here, And he shared that nearly 10% of college graduates, 10% of college graduates believe that Judith Sheindlin, or Judge Judy, sits on the Supreme Court. So what are we to do? Well, lucky for us, we have a man who is certainly worthy of his own civic crown, a man whose life's work has been to share in minute and wonderful detail the story of the founding and framing of our country. And I can assure you that if America took courses with Dr. Gordon Lloyd, their opinion of how useful that civics class would be would shoot up to the very highest ranking on the dictionary. So a good friend of mine, a good friend of the Reagan Foundation, Dr. Lloyd is here tonight to discuss curating the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming America's professor, Dr. Lloyd. Just so you know, at the end, he wanted me to remind, so at the end of tonight, courtesy of the Ashbrook Center, we have a copy of one of his books, The Bill of Rights, the core documents, which he'll be signing, will be given out. So everybody in the audience tonight will get a copy of this.
See, Americans love something free, don't they? Freedom, liberty. Oh, you said?
How's that good sound?
Oh, that sounds terrific. You know, you're getting better every year, Tony. That was good.
A lot of practice.
A lot of practice. No, that was good. Well, welcome to you all. And it's good to see familiar faces and some new faces. So thank you for coming out on September the 17th. Every morning I read your Los Angeles Times. And it was a great surprise. It wasn't a great surprise. We wouldn't know it was Constitution Day. There's no reference whatsoever to Constitution Day Daylight Time, except for an op-ed piece by Jonah Goldberg talking about how current president and all the Democratic candidates don't have the faintest idea about the Constitution. And that is something with which I tend to agree. It's not only the young that don't know, it is the elderly who are running for civic office who don't know. You think just because they're running for president, they can do whatever they want to do, or can do whatever they want to do. Whatever happened to Congress? Well, that's the subject of next year's talk. And we'll find out. Tony introduced something very interesting, language. Talking about looking up what civics means, finding definitions. So I thought what I would do tonight is start with the idea of curating the Constitution by asking the question, well, what is curating? And if you think about it, there are two meanings. One I would put as a capital C, and the other one I would put as a small c. And curating with a capital C, for those of you who are high church or know about high church, a curate is somebody who helps a vicar dealing with pastoral matters. That is a curate. And that's where one of the understandings of curating comes from. It is helping, it is pastoring, which means that there's always going to be trouble, but the curator is supposed to bring hope and reconciliation, etc. Within the last few years, I have discovered another meaning of the word curate, which I would call small c curate. And that is, my website has been described as, it has been curated for you, the reader. And I thought, well, I don't quite understand that. What it means is that we have selected all the documents that you need, that you could put into your way of thinking, and put it together to make it your story without having to make it your story. It's all there, you just pick and choose. And I don't particularly think that that understanding of curating the Constitution is very helpful. I think the old-fashioned way is much more useful, that is, as a pastoral understanding of curating. On the other hand, we live in a commercial republic. Somebody has to pay the bills. And if you just decide that curating is taking care of this, that, and the other, what if no one shows up? So you have to reach out. But you don't have to necessarily dumb it down. And that becomes the problem of civic education in schools. That I think there is too much emphasis on that young people can't read and write, or it's above them. For example, the first paragraph of the Federalist Papers I hand out to graduate students, and graduate students look at it and say, I can't read this. This must have been written for elites. And the answer was, no, it was written in op-ed pieces in newspapers. Okay? What we have done in education, in civic education, is actually considered our students incapable of decent thought and capable reading. I can tell you, right here in this room, there's a son of mine who would read Machiavelli at age 15, and absolutely great, but and I'm very proud of him. But that doesn't happen today. You have to feel good about yourself. He didn't feel particularly good about himself. He makes more money than I do. All right. So we might ask, having looked at the word curating, what is curating? It is caring is pastoral. Also, curating with small c is sort of making it easy for you to put things together to be whatever it is that you want. Well, then let's look at that. On Broadway, there's a big hit, and it's called "What the Constitution Means to Me." And it's coming out to LA, and Angela and I are going to go see it for sure. And it's a story about how this young girl, 15 to 16-year-old, tried to raise money for her college education by going to Rotary clubs, etc., and talking about how wonderful the Constitution is, how terrific the Founding Fathers were, etc. And she got money, and she did a very good job, but now she's in her 40s and is reflecting about what the Constitution means to her. And she says that was one huge, nasty myth that she went through during that time. And it was part of her education and civic education, and she regrets it, and she's going to change it. So she took it to the stage. And What the Constitution Means to Me is a story about how she cannot find herself in the Constitution. She's a woman, she's this, that, and the other, and so what the Constitution means to me is absolutely nothing because it doesn't talk to me. Well, one word that is wrong in that whole presentation, in my opinion, is me. You're asking the wrong question. It rather is, where do you fit into the constitutional story? It's about we, not me. It doesn't start off with me, the individual, in the preamble. It starts off, we, the people. So it's a story about a people. It's not a story about me as a particular individual. But it's a hit. And it's going to be a hit in LA. But is that, I pose it to you, is that curating the Constitution? I wish there's a question. I wish that Tony had given me a question mark at the end of my talk. A couple of years ago, the lost art of compromise. I could turn that into a question. And last year, it dealt with the least dangerous branch, or the most dangerous branch. I could turn that into a question. The question he asked me this time, he didn't ask me a question, he said, why don't you give a talk on curating the Constitution? And I'd like to put a question behind that. What does curating mean? And are we curating? Another recent thing that's is the show that's going on. Oh my goodness. Oh, come in, please. I can't believe it. An old friend and colleague from Pepperdine, Mike Shire. Oh. This is the first time he's ever showed up for anything I've done. Oh no, that is absolutely wonderful. Thank you, and Mrs. Shaw. That's wonderful. Thank you. Where was I, Rosemary? Have you nodded off? But Mike Shire just took me in. Did you plan that? No. Anyway, Mike, we're talking about curating the Constitution. And what is curating? Oh, I know it was. And it was, we're talking about things that are coming, are in the air, etc., about the Constitution. And the latest one is in the New York Times, 1619. And you think, what is important about that? Well, it shows you that dating things in the American story, if you're going to curate the American story, dates matter. And what is the importance of 1619? It's 300 years ago. So anniversaries kind of matter. Not every, today is, what is it, 232? Yeah, right, that's something to really get excited about. And then 232. The big one, in terms of those who take the founding seriously, is going to be 2026, which is going to be the anniversary of 1776. But in the meantime, we have other stories of curating to do. So 2019 is actually a story about what's important about America. This is the date at which the first slave arrived in America. And the story unfolds that everything about America, anything that is important, is due to slavery. And that's the American story. So I ask you, is that curating the Constitution? Well, it certainly replaces 1620 as the start. And that is the time of the Mayflower Compact. And that would imply that some kind of consent, not enslavement, is the starting story of America. And that you have people, they sit down and what do? They write a document. And they sign the document, which would imply that American story is a story of consent and also of documentation, which is a totally different story than a story of enslavement and growing and becoming different and better on the backs of others. So the 1919 stories is a story of America being that the American founding, the American story is not something to be proud of. And I ask the question, is that curated? Now, having given a certain critique of that, let me pull back a minute. And that is, it is true in the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century that the American story was full of, shall we say, mythical ideas of greatness and going out west and shooting and the pioneers and doing all of that and everything, and certain people did suffer as a consequence of that, and it wasn't a balanced account. And so as a teacher, I was in favor of if I were curating, I would try to have a balanced account. And the case for Howard Zinn and starting the story in 1492, see, I'm thinking that if you're a curator, you have to know when to start the story. Because the kind of story that unfolds differs from where the birth occurs and how the birth occurs. Is it a stillbirth? Is it a rape? Is it a consent? What kind of birth took place? And 1492 with Howard Zinn is Columbus, and that is total rape. And so anything that happens after that is downhill. So the American story is a story of enslavement. Now, I at first was in favor of doing that, certainly with college students and graduate students, because it provided a balanced approach with adults being able to understand both sides of the story. But my experience has been that in the last 10 years or so, that balance is gone. That Howard Zinn and the story I told you about what the Constitution means to me, and the idea of 2019 have become the dominant story. And so I think that I believe in a conversation. The American story is a story about conversation. It's not that all of it, at one time, everybody was in a terrific shape, and now we have incivility. There was incivility from the very beginning. You get incivility with elections. It'll come. Why? Because in part, you want to win an election. And how do you get to beat your opponent? You tell them how nasty they are. That's happened at the beginning. It's gone through. Madison had to face it. Other people like George Washington had to face it. Because he would win, so the people who opposed him were deemed to be idiots. Quite rightly so. But what I'm getting at is not that the American story has changed so that we're now lost and we don't fight each other and no one talks, and this has never happened before. It has happened before. What I think has changed is that outcomes have not been accepted. That when I arrived, I'm an immigrant. All right, so I've lost my audience already. When I arrived in America, I didn't quite understand how you would have how candidates would absolutely vilify each other. And then at the end, they'd shake hands. I never did understand that. But that is part of the American story. That is, you talk, you say nasty things, even exaggeration. But at the end, you accept the outcome, you shake hands and say, wait 2 years, I'll get you there. Or wait 4 years and I'll get you there. Or whatever. That's what is lost. That aspect of the American story, that somehow we cannot converse and then agree that we lost that one. I mean, Patrick Henry was very much opposed to the Constitution. And he did everything he could to get the Constitution defeated. But he lost. And his rally folks came to him and said, so, Mr. Henry, what do we do now? He said, go home. Well, I mean, that seems so straightforward, but not today. What do we do? Well, let's see what part of the Constitution we can pluck to see what we can do, or avoid, or become clever with it. All right, that's my sort of general introduction. I am not pessimistic, because I think that there have been incredible difficulties that America has faced, and curating the Constitution is a long and difficult task, and it takes more than one person or more than one institution to do that task. And I think curating the Constitution has to have the conversation, because there's been a conversation from the very beginning about what the Constitution is supposed to do, and people from the very beginning had questions about it. And there was a defense. And that is part, it seems to me, of the American story and curating conversation, but also accepting the outcome. And the ultimate, of course, is Lincoln. It's time to heal the wounds. I mean, my goodness. How do you curate a Constitution that's just fallen apart, where people are killing each other? How do you start over? Well, first of all, you have to forgive. And the next one is you try to build. That's how I understand to be curating. I do not understand curating in the lower C sense of just providing whatever it is for me. I don't find curating to be, aha, gotcha, here is a nasty story. A curator does not present a nasty story. And I am not saying that there should be both sides. In fact, I'm saying there should be both sides. October the 1st is going to be fascinating for Beijing. That is the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party taking over China. And they're going to have a big celebration. And I wouldn't call that a curation. I'm going to call that, it has nothing to do with conversation. You better be in line. You better be in footstep. You better march nicely. And Hong Kong, watch out. So I don't consider curating to be some kind of one story that fits all and everybody better fall in line. I think that the American story is about conversation, and that is what needs to be retrieved. So with that kind of introduction, which is important that I do, otherwise I'm not fulfilling my duties as a member of the board. The board is an incredible outfit. So that is curating the Constitution. I mean, we could go in and say, well, what is the Constitution? Was the Constitution with a capital C? The Constitution with a small c. And Constitution with a capital C involves separation of powers and Bill of Rights and whatever it is. And it seems to me that the presidential candidates, including all the current candidates, seem to be making promises or that doesn't involve Congress at all. That they can do whatever. I can go down the candidates with you, and we will ban guns, we will build a wall, we will tax the 1%, we will do such and such. Where do they get that power from? It may be a great idea, but don't you have to persuade somebody to do it? And so it's not just the kids, it's the candidates that need to be persuaded. And talking earlier, I'm absolutely surprised in 2016 and now 2020, the number of first-year senators. In 2016, it was the Republican Party. In 2020, it is the Democratic Party. The number of first-year senators who are running for president. What's wrong with being a senator of the United States? Isn't the Senate part of the Constitution? Isn't Congress part of the Constitution? So, I am not pessimistic, but I think a lot of work needs to be done. So what am I going to do with you today? Now that I've introduced the idea of curating and sort of constitutionalism, what is a constitution supposed to do? Not everything, but lay things out. What I'm going to do, before I start, what joins, you see, darn you, Tony, you make me think too much. Curating the Constitution is that if the Constitution were perfect, if life were perfect, you wouldn't need a cure. So there's some understanding of being a curate, which suggests that life is imperfect, or that we're fallen creatures, or that we're not quite up to it. So I think the curate and the Constitution go together because the object of a Constitution is not to create a perfect union, it's to create a more perfect union. That there are always going to be imperfections. And so the curate's job is to not only to point out the imperfections, but to point out hope. That it is possible. I think that's the American story, and I don't think that American story is being told, either by the left or the right now. So, I'm going to take you on a walk of old Philadelphia and the founding. It seems perhaps a bit old, but today is Constitution Day. So, we're going to do it. It's interesting that it was Congress that introduced the idea of Constitution Day several years ago, and law schools were sort of resistant. And I remember that one of the law schools that ran a program on this, the title was, "Is Constitution Day Constitutional?" So let's start. I have a website, I have many websites, but I'm going to walk you through some of the websites that I would think would be important in terms of curating the Constitution. I cannot be the only curator. You have to have several. There's not just one story, there are elements to the story. And it's not just the founding, there are other stories that have to be told in curating the Constitution. But tonight, I'm just going to try to go through one part of the story, the early part of the story. And here is a map of Philadelphia, in which 40,000 people lived within that area. And there were 400 pubs. What we might call a liquidating society. At least it wasn't a litigious society, with 400 lawyers for every person. But this is a map of Philadelphia. Now, let's see, what have we remembered and what have we forgotten? How have we, whoever we are, maybe not we the people, and maybe we the curators, how have we remembered Philadelphia, which is a historical place in which a historical event took place? All right, well, let's start off with James Madison. We all know James Madison, right? He was part of the Constitution, this, that, the other. And so let's take a look at where James Madison lived. Right there. Yeah, Mrs. House's boarding house. That's nice, isn't it? But Mrs. House's boarding house. Mrs. House's daughter was married to a Virginian, and the Virginians loved to come to this place because they knew they were welcome. And the Confederation Congress from 1776 to 1787 met there. Not in Mrs. House's boarding house, but they met in Philadelphia. And so this became a regular for Virginians. This spot, Mrs. House's boarding house, was the spot where James Madison lived during that time. And a number of the Virginia delegates met. And they were there early because they were the ones who initiated the story about the creation of the Constitution. And when they were there, and no one was showing up, they drafted the Virginia Plan, which is what they introduced when there were enough delegates to hold the Constitution Convention. So I would think that that's something that's worth remembering. Where James Madison lived, the Virginia delegation, Mrs. House's boarding house, women are involved. Women were very big in entrepreneurship and running hostels, not just doing silly things, but they had they managed to secure a lot of the, I must have said something silly. My audience is losing me. All right, so you'd think that that's worth remembering. So let's take a look at what we've remembered, what we have forgotten, and how do we curate this spot at this event. See, a story involves not just a plot in some sense of deep state. It involves event, it involves a document, it involves a place, and it involves people. Right, so it seems to me that this is something worth curating. All right, so let's go there. Blank. So Mrs. House's boarding house. Now, I started curating the Constitution in the 1980s in anticipation of an anniversary, which is 1987, which is the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. So I decided to start doing some research in the 1980s about where things are, the kind of things we were just talking about. So I found out where Madison lived. So I tried to figure, well, where is it? And it's on that corner, and with all due regard for the elderly, this is a restroom. And you say what you expect me to say for the young. But they know it. But on the side of that restroom in the 1980s, you just click on, Tony, I don't know, if you click on that sign, yeah, there's a sign there. See it? Yeah, click on that. Let's click on it again. Then we can't do it anymore. All right. But if we had the time to curate properly, we would notice that this sign says, it's on this spot that James Madison lived. And it is a bathroom. So I just don't think that is an appropriate curating of a person and a place and an event. Well, let's say, so if you keep, there it is. James Madison, delegate to the Continental Congress, father of the Constitution. Isn't that good enough to have a spot remembered in your name? Right, on a signboard. And so, I thought, well, I'll follow this through. Because now we're getting into the 21st century. How do we keep remembering, or how do we keep forgetting? Where does it all go in this curating story? And so, let's enter the 20th century. This is 1980s. We enter the 20th century. Good. All right, so now the house has been, the lavatory has been pulled down, and instead there's a slab of concrete there, in good East German fashion, and where anybody can say whatever they want. So democracy has become not meeting to deliberate and exchange and compromise. It is stand up there and say whatever the heck is on your mind. The irony, of course, is that what is in front of it is dissent, the First Amendment. But who wrote the First Amendment but James Madison? So now James Madison, if he's remembered, is remembered by that slab of concrete but without his name. So let's move on into the 2012, 20 such and such, and keep going. So now if we keep going, and keep going one more, and one more, this is what we have today. Welcome, SEPTA Public Transit, elevator to Market, Frankfurt line, trains to Frankfurt and Penn's Landing. So when you go there, you don't see anything of Madison at all. That's what you have. And I asked you, is that curating the Constitution? Well, and who then is responsible for curating the Constitution? Because various people, both public officials and private, decided somehow it was not important to keep Madison's name and the spot, Mrs. House's boarding house, in good condition to remember. There's no way, not even the story I've just told. That story's not in the books. That story I have put together because of research that I was interested in, and I'm interested in Madison, and I'm interested in how the Constitution lives and dies, which means that very often I travel a very sort of straight line between those people who consider themselves to be originalists, that you just look at the Constitution, it can tell you whatever, it's very, very clear. And then those who see the living document, which seems to mean that well, you make it what you want to be. And I'm neither. And I'm a curator of the Constitution. A curator requires understanding the purpose of the Constitution, I think, and adapting it to, not just adapting the Constitution to modern times, but adapting modern times to the Constitution. I think it's both ways at work. All right, so that's one story. How many stories can we tell? I should stop soon. No? Oh, I have 3 hours? I want to hear what people have to say about curating.
Why is the scene of G. Morris's accident important?
I was gonna say that. You jumped it. All right, let's move to G. Morris. This is, you see, curating from the crowd. This is, you see, crowdsource curating, not professorial creating. This is populism. This is elitism. It's my what? It's my show? It's not my show, it's her show. I want to come back here next year. It's her show, right? You're an inquiring mind? You have patience? Can you wait?
Yes.
All right, so therefore I will start. All I know is that you can govern yourself and you have patience. Therefore, I will give you the story now rather than later. All right, so where did you see Bruno Mars up there? He's not there now. See, that Tony just moved it.
It's red.
Ah, scene of G. Morris's accident. Let's move there. So this is a story about G. Morris, this Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur is not governor, it's Gouverneur, it's French. That was the name of his mother. So Gouverneur Morris was a representative of New York at the time, the Confederation Congress, which was meeting in 1776 to 1787. And then he was also a member of the convention that wrote the Constitution, by which time he had moved from New York to Pennsylvania. But as a delegate from New York, he was in Pennsylvania, and he was on this spot. Shall we go to the spot? All right, and on this spot, here he is, he has a peg leg. There is a right leg, and I will show you a picture in the future which shows you that it was his left leg. Never mind, we all know that he lost a leg. And how did he lose a leg? Well, he was in a carriage with a married woman. Married women didn't seem to have a problem with Gouverneur Morris. Their husbands did. but not the married women. And so Gouverneur Morris was in this carriage with a married woman, and an irate husband ran after the carriage, and Gouverneur Morris jumped out. And the carriage wheel ran over his leg. And he went to the doctors, and the advice was, off with your leg. And in those days, at least 80% of the people who had that kind of no anesthetics, no painkillers, right? All right, just too young for alcohol. And so off with his leg. He had a peg on it. And that's the story of how he lost his leg on that particular spot. Now, that particular spot, if we go there, is right on one of those cobblestone streets, which is another way of trying to understand Philadelphia. There is a battle going on in Philadelphia between 1976 and 1976 to 2000, which involves Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, 200th anniversaries. But how to portray Philadelphia, the Philadelphia story, as part of the American story. You've got your originalists. Yes?
So my question is, when you're talking about it doesn't matter about his leg, wouldn't a carriage, like, I remember seeing this on Great Things, but it was, because I remember looking at another carriage and another one, it was more modern and it was a later one. The later one only had one sided door. So it would only have one side, and you have to jump out one side. There was no other side door. My question is,
What leg? The one he lost. I don't know. You know, you have more knowledge of the history of carriages. I mean, when I go to the airport in a car, I always sit on the right-hand side. When they drop me off, that means I'm not gonna get whacked by. Just common sense that comes from traveling. And yes, Gouverneur Morris didn't have common sense. So he got out the wrong side. And he paid the price for it. Right. So, this is the spot. Now, this shows a sort of a battle between what we might call those who wanted to return Philadelphia to originalism. That meant old bricks, cobblestones, etc. And the sort of progressive post-revolutionary architecture that wished to have a lot of concrete. And this is an example of what I would call the originalist, cobblestone. No, you can't hardly walk over it. But it's on a spot right there that he lost his leg. Now, I'm not advocating that all of you, or even most teachers, curate the Constitution in the sense in which I've just done. Because I'm mad. I'm madly in love with this story. And stories so connected. And I enjoy them. But I think stories like this are very, very important. It brings the founders alive to being people who are human and imperfect, and having it, because you point out people's imperfections doesn't mean to say that you have to dismiss them. That is a very 20th century position, and one with which I'll come straight forward and say, I disagree. It presumes that if we don't have perfection, there's no redemption. Now, in Morris's case, there was no redemption. If we go back to the story, yeah, when he was there, I mean, I even offered to pay for a spot on there. This is where G. Morris lost his leg, but the Philadelphia folks didn't take me up on it. So if we go down there, no, I think it's a bit above. An author called Van Doren, Great Rehearsal, the rumor was that Gouverneur Morris jumped from a balcony to avoid an irate husband, thus had to have his leg amputated. Van Doren, as does MacDonald, who's another historian, says Morris actually lost his left leg being thrown from a carriage. According to Van Doren, there was no amorous balconies in Philadelphia. A friend has said to Morris that the loss of his leg might have a good effect on his morals, that is, his constitution, since it would reduce his inclination to engage in the pleasures and disputations of life into which young men are too apt to be led. The young Morris responded, "You argue the matter so handsomely, and point out so clearly the advantages of being without legs, that I am almost tempted to part with the other." John Jay, an author of the Federalist Papers, wrote to Morris that he was tempted to wish that Morris had lost something else. So, I don't think by telling those stories, I have relegated the framers to idiots not worthy of respect. What I have tried to do is to restore the balance. And because I don't think the balance is treating them as maybe human beings, but the attempt is to say that there is not much that's good about them, or not much that is human about them at all. So we're running from them being gods to being devils. And I'm trying to suggest that most of us, most of the time, are pretty decent, and that we have, well, not me, but a lot of you have temptation. Cage helps. All right, so we jumped, right? But that's the story of Bruno Mars. Now let's go to the other side of the street. If we go to, I don't know how to, the other, right, if you go up, not Robert, no. That's where, that Graf House, by the way, is where Thomas Jefferson wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And he moved there rather than this central hub. So he moved to the suburbs because it was less noisy to write the Declaration. If we move to my right, yeah, there, right there, Morris's townhouse. There are two Morrises. One is Gouverneur, the other is Robert. They're not related. And Robert Morris was the financier of the Revolution who ended up in a debtor's prison. All right, that's an American story. And I think that should be curated and included as wanting a more perfect, but you cannot get a perfect. And are you willing to settle for imperfect improvement or no improvement at all? And that's some tough choices, but as we grow older, we realize that's a lot of what we face in life. How sad. We thought when we grew older, those would disappear. They don't. If we click on Morris's townhouse, what am I supposed to, did I say something wrong? Good. See, I have an audience here who, particularly a neighbor, who is very, very aware. I'm very nervous for me because she doesn't think I have speaking talent or the ability to respond to an audience, and she's so nervous for me. So if I say something wrong, she's going to go out of it. Anyway, this is Robert Morris's townhouse. It's across the street from where Mrs. House's boarding house was. Am I boring you?
No.
Good. I'll finish soon. You see, curating is not an easy business. A, you have to know your stuff, and B, you have to know when to shut up. Which I'm not, as my neighbor says, not very good at. All right, so Mr. Morris's townhouse was the most elegant house in Philadelphia. And when George Washington arrived with the Virginia delegation, he was prepared, according to legend. He was certainly, and legends and myths and stories are part of curating. In order to balance out, are you a good myth or a bad myth? In order to try to, you need to have a counter story, but not a counter, in my opinion, you don't need a counter story to actually destroy the story, but rather to bring balance to the story. Say, well, now wait a minute, Grandpa didn't catch a 17-foot fish. Right? He may have caught a 6-foot fish, and not 17 foot. Because if I don't stop you in about 10 years' time, it will be 25 feet. Right? So that kind of balancing, whoa, wait, come on, I think is a good corrective. But saying because he didn't get a 17-foot fish, and he promised to get a 17-foot fish, he didn't, he lied. Therefore, dismiss him because nothing that he says is the truth. That's not curating. That's destroying. And I think that is what I have difficulty with and working through. What is balancing and what is undermining? On this site, Robert Morris's townhouse, if we scroll down, you see, it was on one side it was a women's restroom where Mrs. House's boarding house was, and the other side it was a men's restroom, which is where Mr. Morris's townhouse was. So you got that building like that. And then they decided, they being whoever it is that's interested in 1987 and 2007 and all these anniversaries of curation and creation, decide that they need to do something with this house. Mr. Morris's house, where Washington stayed, is important for two reasons, other than he stayed there. One is, when the Constitution was formed, when the government moved to Philadelphia from New York, that became the presidential house. And later on, moved to Washington, D.C. to become the White House, named because of the marble or the construction. But Mr. Morris's townhouse became the presidential house. That's where Washington did his farewell speech. That's where he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. That's where Adams, after him, discussed the Alien and Sedition Acts and introduced them. A lot of things happened at that house. However, that was only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that when digging took place on the site, slave bones were found. And so there was a dispute. And this is part of the American story. There was a dispute. Should we preserve this house as the presidential house and tell the public about all kinds of things that the first two presidents did here? Or shall we make it a story of slavery? And the answer is, it became a story of slavery. And you can read this as that, and it's called like the Great Contradiction. And it's open to the visitors 24 hours a day because it's not enclosed. And it's visited very, very often, probably by one of the top 10 visitors that you take young children to National Archives, and they kick each other in the shins and don't worry about what's going on. And this is another one. And the story is, this is not really the presidential house, it is a slave house. This is where Hercules, which is one of Washington's slaves, well, how could that happen? Very complicated. In Philadelphia, slavery had ended. But Philadelphia was also a capital in which, quote, foreign nations like Virginia could come. And as a consequence, you are a citizen of this state under the laws thereof. And foreigners or foreign states were not governed by Philadelphia laws. So that you had that certain southern folks brought in slaves, even though slavery was not permitted. You say, well, say, oh, why permit them in? And the answer is because Philadelphia was not only a city in Pennsylvania, it was the capital of a nation in which there was both slavery and non-slavery. And what do you do in a capital? We face that all the time. We face it here, right now. I mean, are you a citizen? Who's a natural born citizen today? You're born under the jurisdiction thereof. Okay, so the house became a story of slavery. And it is in the shadow of the Declaration of Independence being written in Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. And so it creates a contentious American story about slavery, the first presidency, the second presidency, Declaration of Independence, and Liberty Hall, all in that corner. You could spend an entire hour on that corner just reflecting about what does it mean to curate the Constitution and curate America when a lot of the evidence has been lost or selected. And I'm not talking about conspiracies, I'm just talking about decisions that are made. For example, a bunch of teachers I was talking about the Constitution, they said, well, we can remember the preamble. Well, that's good, at least you remember part of the Constitution. That's not easy, right? Because I had a copy, so I could always check. And they said, well, we remember it from, what is it, Jailhouse Rock, or Truck? What's that? Schoolhouse Rock. So, tell me, how does Schoolhouse Rock go? They remembered it, right? Oh, come on. You don't have to be in tune. Tell me, what does it say? We the people in order to form a more, what's missing? Of the United States. It doesn't say that. It just says, we the people in order. It doesn't say, we the people of the United States. That's completely dropped. And you say, well, so what? Oh, well, you have just uncurated a whole century of war and this, that, and the other, and you have, so it's wonderful that the teachers know that rock song. But there's something missing. So where was I? Schoolhouse Rock took me off of where I was. Come on. So I think that's enough about the we could do more about the Torah. You want questions now?
Yeah, maybe.
Or let's end it. Let's just end it. Let's go to the tavern. Should we go to the tavern? All right. So on September the 17th. No, September the 15th, which was a Saturday. September the 17th was a Monday. September the 15th, they had done everything. September the 16th, the Constitution was sent to John Dunlap to do it. By the way, do you know, was this a quiz?
Yeah.
In which language?
English.
Stop it. You didn't wait until I finished the question. You can't press the buzzer until I finish the question. In which second language was the Constitution written? German. Shall we give him a book? Later? All right. German. Huge German settlement. And one of the things I didn't realize when I went to Philadelphia, started curating for myself in the 17th, not the 17th, I curated the 1780s, but I was there in the 1990s, was to find out, was the extent to which there was a variety of religions. On the north side, there were Lutheran churches, and Washington went there. Why were there Lutheran churches? Because there's a huge German immigrant population. I thought they only came in the late 19th century. No, it was beer in Philadelphia. And so many taverns. Okay? And then the next thing is, there were 2 Catholic churches on the south side. More taverns. Why were there 2 Catholic churches? Because the Irish were there. I only thought the Irish and the Germans came in the late 19th century and caused all these problems with socialism and this, that, and the other, and Nazism and beer and wine, opened up the wine industry in California, opened up the beer industry in the Midwest, turned it all normal, decent Americans into alcoholics. Natural born Americans, yes. So, we move to where the finger is pointing. And the finger is pointing at the city tavern. And the city tavern is where all the delegates went to commemorate. Did they disagree? You know they did. I know they did. 3 refused to sign. 3 left early in disgust. Can you have an influence if you leave? No. What kind of influence do you have if you don't sign? Face retribution. Others signed with reluctance. So once again, it's not that at the beginning all was sweet and full of daisies. People disagreed with each other and they had bad, nasty arguments. But they could go and drink afterward. And say, all right, wait till next election. We don't seem to be able to do that now. That's what's the problem is. How can you curate without drinking? At that spot is the city tavern. And if we click on that spot, Tony, we will see that that's what the city tavern looked like back in 1787. Today, if you go down, this is what the city tavern looks like. Look pretty darn close to what it looked like. The menu is a replica. The dress is a replica. This is an attempt not to become postmodern or deny the architecture of the founding, but to try to replicate it. This is sort of like originalism architecture. So, and it's in this building that the framers said, we all, in Washington in his diary said, we all gave a cordial leave of each other and went to the tavern. Okay, now I managed to retrieve a menu in my various pursuits. And when I was younger, it was very exciting. I retrieved this menu, and it said September the 15th. Yeah, all right, 55 gentlemen, there were 55 people who were there at the convention. And I thought I had discovered the menu for George Washington's farewell dinner and the framers. And it turned out that I had discovered the menu of the day before. And that becomes part of the problem of curating. What happens if you don't? You include that in your story and show that you can make errors. But I have done subsequent research which indicates that the menu didn't change that much from day to day. And if we were to look and see what if we keep going down, where do we find? Oh, we won't find George. We won't find the menu there, will we? It's in resources. Let's go to resources and the farewell of resources, exhibits, resources. Search for menu tavern. All right, there you go. Elections. Entertainment and worship. All right, there you go. Oh, so here's the menu that I managed to retrieve. 55 gentlemen's dinners and fruits, relishes, olives, etc. 20 pounds, 12 and 6. 54 bottles of Madeira. Somebody got lost. 20 pounds. 60 bottles of claret. I guess somebody got a little extra. 8 bottles of old stock. 22 bottles of porter. 8 bottles of cider. 12 bottles of beer. 7 large bowls of punch. Spelling was not part of the framers' speciality. And we shall not curate that one. Cigars, which I don't think is, maybe that's how it was spelled then, but spermacety, candles, etc. too. This is what I like to decanters, wine glasses, and tumblers broken. I think onwards with the revolution. We're not French, no, we're American. I would drink. Not off with their heads. I would drink. To 16 servants. You see, this is what I love about America. The servants get paid. It's not servitude as it was in Europe. This is a new country. We pay. We even write in the Constitution, we pay our representatives. Right? We're paid 16 bottles of claret for 16 servants and musicians. 5 bottles of Madeira, 7 bools of punch. And so that is the bill, 89 pounds. If we come down, and I managed to figure this out in 2018. It has 2011 up there, stop, so that bill came to $15,400 in 2011 money. I've now figured it just before I came, but I couldn't get it corrected on the site. In 2019, it is something like $19,000. So that was a dinner worth $19,000, including the musicians and the servants. Now here, in addition to that, people got paid, the musicians got paid separately. So George Khrushchev got a pound. Mr. Schultz, Mr. Trenner, John Kaiser, William Hartel, Philip Rothman, David Karlsruhe, John Mueller, Konrad Spackenberg. What the heck are these Germans doing there? Mr. Khrushchev's 15th down relative, who's also called George, writes to me and says, what do you know about grand George Khrushchev? And I say, anything that you're going to tell me. And it turns out that he and the others were mercenaries, hired by the British, German mercenaries to fight in the Revolutionary War and got caught. And they got put in an American prison. And in 1783, when the war was over, and the idea was reparations, exchanges, prisoners of war, etc., this group decided not to leave America. They loved American prison food. But they loved to stay in America. And I think that's an incredible story. A story of hope, a story of curating that shows in prison in 1783, German immigrants play at George Washington's farewell. That is an American story that's worth telling and retelling, and I doubt it will occur in any other country in the world. So however much we hear criticism of America, and we hear it often, we ought to remember that never before in the history of the world had 55 people sat down to write a constitution, deliberated up and down the country, Germans playing at the farewell address, a party, and not a drop of blood was spilled. Never before in the history of the world. Isn't that something worth curating?